At 4:25 hours local time, 14 Ukrainian FP-1 drones approached the strategic Engels air base from the west. Their targets were the Tu-95MS and Tu-160 aircraft parked inside the base, along with the fuel depots and support facilities required to keep them operational. The mission proceeded smoothly until the formation entered the airspace over western Saratov Oblast. There, an S-350 Vityaz operator had been staring at an almost empty sky throughout the night when a series of tracks suddenly appeared on his radar display. 14 signals appeared from the west at a distance of 40 miles, dispersed across a band of airspace nearly 2 miles wide. There was no clear formation. There were only weak returns moving east at 120 miles per hour. Some appeared for 2 radar sweeps and then vanished. Others flickered in positions slightly farther to the left or right, as though the radar were tracking several completely separate groups of UAVs. The operator's hand paused over the target classification panel. Something was wrong. The 14 FP-1s did not form a clear formation, but were spread across multiple flight corridors, maintaining low altitude and continuously disappearing into ground clutter. Their composite airframes reflected very little radar energy. When flying close to the terrain, their already weak tracks were further concealed by buildings, power lines, trees, and background interference. But 3 drones on the northern side of the formation began climbing to an altitude of 1,000 feet. Their automated assessment systems did not react to the danger. There was no response to the threats. This behavior had been programmed in advance and was triggered precisely when the formation entered the 30-mile radius around Engels Air Base. One FP-1 maintained a direct course toward the radar area. The other 2 separated toward opposite sides and continuously changed their approach angles, as though they were searching for the position of the air defense battery. As the 3 UAVs climbed above the layer of ground clutter, their radar returns became significantly stronger. The S-350 battery's 50N6A multifunction radar no longer had to struggle to separate them from the terrain. They were now the 3 clearest targets on the screen. Then a device aboard the lead FP-1 began transmitting in the 6 GHz frequency band. It emitted short digital signal packets that imitated the data link of a reconnaissance drone transmitting coordinates, telemetry data, or compressed imagery back to a command center. Air defense operators had been trained for years to prioritize targets that were transmitting signals. A UAV transmitting data might be confirming a target's position. A UAV changing direction might be searching for the radar. And a UAV climbing to higher altitude might be preparing to guide strike weapons following behind it. The Ukrainians had turned that very training procedure into a trap. They used 3 easily detectable FP-1s to create the appearance of a reconnaissance UAV group hunting for the S-35O battery, while the remaining 11 reduced their signal transmissions and continued flying low toward Engels. The operator calculated as the targets moved closer: 14 UAVs, multiple flight paths, 3 prominent targets. Then he opened fire. The launch tube covers on the 5OP-6A launcher snapped open. 9 M96 missiles were simultaneously ejected from the launcher. Their main engines ignited, sending them straight into the sky before they banked sharply toward the west. Within seconds, they accelerated to Mach 4 while climbing to an altitude of 25,000 feet. At higher altitude, the missiles could maintain greater speed and range because air resistance was reduced. The same rocket motor could propel a missile across a certain distance through dense air, but could achieve twice that distance in the thinner air above. Time to impact: 41 seconds. The operator's fingers tapped repeatedly on the control panel inside the 5OK6A command vehicle. 10 seconds. 5 seconds. The first explosion occurred at 04:26 hours local time. The proximity fuse activated when the missile passed within 15 feet of the lead FP-1, inside the optimal lethal radius of the fragmentation warhead. The 9M96E2 itself is a missile approximately 18 feet long, with a launch weight of 850 pounds and a 50-pound fragmentation warhead. During most of its flight, The missile uses inertial guidance periodically corrected by the 50N6A multifunction radar. The radar does not need to illuminate the target continuously. It only transmits updates on the UAV's predicted position to correct the missile's trajectory. The warhead detonated. Fragments tore off the right wing, destroyed the engine, and caused the signal in the 6 GHz band to disappear. 8 seconds later, the second missile exploded behind another FP-1. The detonation was off-center, but it still damaged the fuselage and control surfaces. The UAV began losing altitude in a slow spiral. One target destroyed, one target damaged. An almost perfect interception. However, the 3 high-flying FP-1s were only decoys. The operator could not have known that the lead drone transmitted a strong signal. The second maintained a stable flight path. The third continuously changed altitude as though it were searching for the position of the air defense battery. Ukraine had programmed them to precisely imitate the types of targets that Russian crews were trained to prioritize. The third missile had just locked onto its target when the FP-1 suddenly stopped transmitting and dived from an altitude of 1,000 feet. As it descended into the ground clutter, its radar return blended with buildings, trees, and power lines. The 9M96E2 flew toward the predicted position, corrected to the left, and then passed above the target. The fuse did not activate. A few seconds later, the missile self-destructed. 3 missiles had been used. 1 UAV was destroyed. 1 UAV was damaged. The third continued flying. But their mission was not to reach Engels Air Base. They only needed to draw the 50N6A radar and the S-350 crew's attention toward the northern side of the formation. While the operator monitored the results of the interception, the remaining 11 FP-1s continued flying low toward Engels. When the mission clock reached a predetermined point, they dispersed simultaneously. 4 turned northeast, 4 descended even lower, and followed areas with heavy radar reflections. The 3 southern UAVs entered the overlapping zone between the S-350 and a Buk M3 battery. On the radar display, a single formation transformed into a series of small flickering tracks moving in multiple directions. This was not an immediate reaction. Everything had been programmed in advance. The S-350 operator began transferring the 3 southern targets to the Buk M3. But the radar pictures from the 2 systems did not completely match. The S-350 identified one target as track number 1. The Buk M3 detected a signal nearby, but assigned it track number 2. Was it the same FP-1? Because the UAVs were flying low and were frequently concealed by the terrain, the signals continuously appeared and disappeared. The 2 crews had to compare coordinates, speed, and direction of flight before confirming the targets. Nearly 30 seconds passed. During that time, an FP-1 flying at 120 miles per hour could advance nearly 1 mile. The 3 southern UAVs had descended and moved away from the coordinates that had been transferred. The engagement zones of the S-350 and Buk M3 overlapped in range, but radar data, track numbers, and firing authority were not transferred instantly. The S-350 assumed that the targets had entered the area assigned to the Buk M3. The Buk M3 was still trying to determine which tracks were real targets and which were outdated returns being relayed through the network. Neither system wanted to launch a missile at a track that had not been reliably confirmed. The delay in the identification process had turned the overlapping zone between the 2 air defense systems into a temporary corridor. But the temporary corridor was not the only problem. The FP-1 damaged during the first interception continued flying west. Its engine operated intermittently, while one side of the wing had been deformed by fragments, causing the UAV to gradually bank and lose altitude at 100 feet per minute. When it disappeared behind the terrain, the S-350's 50N6A radar continued maintaining a predicted track for several sweeps. On the screen, the target appeared to continue moving. The operator could not know whether the FP-1 had crashed, was only temporarily concealed, or was descending to return. For 20 seconds, the S-350 continued tracking a target that no longer existed. At 120 miles per hour, the remaining 11 FP-1s had advanced another 3 miles toward Engels. The 3 southern UAVs began maneuvering. The lead aircraft reduced its speed by 20%. The second increased its speed by 10%, while the third moved into the gap between the other two and continuously climbed and descended. They did not completely cross paths, but continuously changed order whenever their signals disappeared behind the terrain and then reappeared. The S-350 still identified the Western aircraft as track number 101, while the Buk M3 detected the Eastern aircraft first and also designated it as target number 1. Both systems were seeing real UAVs, but their track numbers no longer represented the same target. If both batteries opened fire on target number 1, they could launch 2 missiles at a single FP-1, while the other 2 continued flying. If both waited, all 3 would pass through. The S-350 commander decided to hold fire. 3 9M96 missiles had been used during the first interception, and he did not want to waste more ammunition on targets that might already have been accepted by the Buk M3. The Buk crew was forced to discard the old tracks and search again on its own. The surveillance radar lowered its scan angle toward the western horizon, but below an altitude of 500 feet, the FP-1 signals blended with buildings, trees, power lines, and moving vehicles. The first sweep produced no clear target. On the second sweep, a weak signal appeared and then disappeared. By the third sweep, a track suddenly appeared at a range of only 14 miles, nearly 2 miles closer than the last coordinates transferred by the S-350. A few seconds later, the second target appeared to the south, followed by the third, appearing between the first 2 tracks. The 3 FP-1s had crossed most of the overlapping zone before the Buk M3 detected them again. At their current speed, every 10 seconds of hesitation allowed the UAVs to advance nearly 2 miles. The 9S-36M fire control radar rotated toward the west and began building new tracks. The first target remained stable for 2 sweeps. The second continuously disappeared into the background clutter. The third changed direction slightly every 5 seconds, forcing the computer to constantly recalculate the interception point. The operator faced a difficult choice: open fire immediately on the confirmed target and allow the other 2 to continue approaching, or wait several more seconds to lock onto all 3 while risking allowing them to penetrate deeper into the protected area. But while the Buk M3 was still deciding, the 11 FP-1s had reached their final target allocation point. The 4 northeastern aircraft turned toward the fuel depots and logistics facilities supporting the Tu-95MS and Tu-160 bombers. 4 others descended below 400 feet. 3 headed toward the aircraft parking area, while the remaining ones circled toward the runway and taxiway. The 3 southern UAVs continued separating, with 1 turning north, 1 maintaining a central course, and the last widening its flight path toward the south, forcing the Buk M3 to expand its tracking area. Only a few minutes earlier, Russian air defenses had been tracking a single formation. Now, they had to protect 4 different areas with the same number of missiles: the fuel depots, the logistics facilities, the bomber parking area, and the runway. The 9S-36M radar finally locked onto 2 southern targets. The interception data was transmitted to the 9A317M launcher, where the 9M317M missiles were ready to leave their launch rails. 11 FP-1s remained in the air. All of them carried warheads. Most were flying below 500 feet, and the nearest were now only 12 miles from Engels. But passing through the overlapping zone between the S-350 and Buk M3 had only been the easy part. Now came the difficult part. The Buk M3 operator had been tracking the 3 southern FP-1s for nearly 5 minutes. On the 9S-36M radar display, hundreds of reflected signals covered the area west of the base. But only 9 targets truly mattered. The 3 FP-1s had passed through the handover zone between the S-350 and Buk M3. The clearest target stabilized at a range of 15 miles, an altitude of 420 feet, and a speed of 119 miles per hour while maintaining an almost constant heading. The radar maintained the track through 2 consecutive sweeps, enough to open fire. the interception data was transmitted to the 9A317M combat vehicle. An icon changed from yellow to red. The launch tube cover opened, and a 9M317M missile left the launcher, rising straight upward before banking sharply toward the west. Only a few seconds later, it exceeded Mach 3, aiming for the intercept point where the FP-1 was predicted to appear about 18 seconds later. The other two UAVs continued flickering in the background clutter, sometimes appearing during one sweep and sometimes disappearing behind structures. The Buk M3 was forced to engage the clearest target first. This FP-1 appeared to present a perfect interception solution. After separating from the formation, it stopped changing its speed, altitude, and heading, continuing directly toward the logistics area west of Engels. But ahead of it was the area with the most complex reflective environment surrounding the base. At a range of 9 miles, the UAV descended below 300 feet and entered the industrial corridor. Below it were metal rooftops, storage tanks, pipelines, railway cars, and vehicles moving between warehouses. The radar waves from the 9S36M reflected not only from the FP-1, but also from the structures below. To the radar, different propagation paths could produce different target positions. At first, the error was only about 60 feet, but it later increased to 120 feet. As the UAV flew deeper into the industrial area, two reflection centers began to separate clearly. The weak signal ahead represented the UAV's actual position. The stronger signal cluster behind it was nearly 4 decibels more powerful and more stable, created by combined reflections from the FP-1's airframe and the metal structures below. The radar saw one target, but that target appeared to exist in 2 nearby positions. If the system selected the weak signal and guessed incorrectly, it could lose the track completely. If it selected the stronger signal cluster, the track would be maintained, but the coordinates would be pulled backward. The computer selected the safer option, maintaining the track between the 2 reflection clusters. During each cycle, the radar transmitted a new coordinate to the missile. The error was only a few dozen feet each time, not enough to trigger an alert, but the error continued accumulating. After 3 seconds, the intercept point was nearly 250 feet behind the real FP-1 and was still slipping farther backward. The 9M317M missile continued operating precisely. It received correction commands and continued racing toward the meeting point provided by the radar. The problem was that the UAV was no longer at that point. At a range of about 4 miles, the missile's radar seeker began searching around the final coordinates provided by the 9S36M. In open airspace, it would only need to lock on to the strongest return, but below it was an industrial area containing thousands of metal surfaces. The seeker detected multiple returns, but none were stable enough to confirm as the target. The real FP-1 was flying below 300 feet ahead of the search area and almost blended into the ground clutter. Its return was weaker than the surrounding structures and appeared only at the edge of the scan zone. The missile continued racing toward the old coordinates. Inside the Buk M3 control vehicle, the operator realized that the strong reflection cluster behind the target was almost stationary relative to the industrial area, while a weak signal ahead continued moving east at a constant speed. The weak signal was the real FP-1. He immediately shifted the tracking point forward. The 9S36M radar transmitted a new correction packet, moving the intercept point to the right and nearly 700 feet farther ahead. But it was too late. The 9M317M was less than 1.5 miles from the old coordinates. At more than Mach 3, it had less than 2 seconds to correct the entire error. The control surfaces deflected sharply. The missile banked to the right and began curving its trajectory toward the real target. But at that speed, it could not change direction like a small FPV. Every maneuver consumed energy and required a wide arc to generate lateral displacement. The new intercept point shifted faster than the missile could turn. The 9M317M passed more than 200 feet behind the FP-1, outside the effective activation range of the proximity fuse. There was no explosion or fragmentation, only a streak of light passing behind it before the missile self-destructed outside the flight corridor. On the 9S36M display, the FP-1's track flickered and then continued moving east. It had survived the Buk M3's first missile. The Russian air defense crew had been deceived by the environment surrounding the base itself. Rooftops, storage tanks, pipelines, and railway cars created a reflection cluster stronger than the real UAV, pulling the track backward with every radar sweep. The missile had flown precisely to the point commanded by the radar. The only problem was that the FP-1 had never been there. The Buk M3 operator had no time to analyze the failure. The UAV that had just escaped the interception was now less than 7 miles from the logistics area. Before the Buk M3 crew could understand why the first missile had missed, the second FP-1 began to climb. From below 400 feet, it rose directly to 900 feet, maintained a speed of 118 miles per hour, and did not change course. A perfect target was waiting to be noticed. The operator hesitated. It was too obvious. It could be a decoy. But the UAV was less than 9 miles from the logistics area. He opened fire. The second 9M-317M missile left the launcher, exceeded Mach 3, and raced toward an intercept point 1 mile away. At the same time, the two remaining FP-1s descended below 200 feet and separated to opposite sides of a raised railway line leading toward Engels. The rail bed and embankments concealed them from the 9S-36M radar. The UAVs appeared for only a few seconds at overpasses or open gaps, then disappeared again behind the reverse slope of the terrain. The high-flying FP-1 still did not change course. The seeker locked onto the target at a range of 4 miles. The warhead detonated less than 30 feet from the UAV, tearing away its wing and engine. The radar confirmed that the target had been destroyed, but it was only a decoy. During the missile's 17-second flight, the two UAVs below had advanced more than half a mile while also forcing the Buk M3 to expend one engagement channel and one missile. When the two FP-1s appeared one after another at a range of 7 miles, the third and fourth missiles were launched toward their predicted intercept points. However, both UAVs immediately descended behind the railway embankment and made slight course changes. The radar lost track, causing both missiles to search around the old coordinates before self-destructing. 4 missiles had been used, but the two UAVs continued advancing. When the distance fell to just over 5 miles, the combat crew launched the final 2 missiles carried by the 9A-317M vehicle. The 5th missile locked onto the northern FP-1 and destroyed it with a proximity fuse detonation. The southern UAV managed to turn into a section of railway lying below the surrounding terrain. Only 10 seconds later, its actual position had shifted nearly 900 feet away from the intercept point. The 6th missile failed to find the target and self-destructed. The ammunition load aboard the 9A-317M vehicle had fallen to 0. 6 missiles had been used to destroy 1 decoy UAV and 1 UAV carrying a warhead. The final FP-1 remained in the air. The other Buk M3 vehicles were monitoring the other approach routes around Engels and did not have enough time to accept a new track. When the FP-1 reappeared below an altitude of 200 feet, it was only 4 miles from the base. The radar could still see the target, but the launcher had no missiles left. The Buk M3 crew was only beginning to realize that something was wrong when the number of signals suddenly increased. The first UAV group had completed its decoy mission. At that exact moment, the second group from the original formation of 14 UAVs also arrived. 3 FP-1s repeated the entire sequence carried out by the previous group, encountering no resistance as they approached the air base. The commander immediately warned the inner defensive line at Engels, 4 low-flying targets approaching from the west. Range 5 miles. Immediate support required. As soon as the warning was received, the Pantsir S-1 battery at Engels Air Base immediately moved into an interception position. The 1RS-1-1E search radar scanned low toward the west, and only a few seconds later, 4 tracks appeared on the display. 4 targets flying extremely low and heading directly toward the base. The Pantsir S-1 was designed to counter exactly this type of target. Each vehicle carried 12 radio command guided 5-7E6 missiles, a 1RS-2-1E tracking radar, and 2 twin-barrel 30mm Tu-A38M cannons with a combined rate of fire of 5,000 rounds per minute. But the four FP-1s did not maintain stable flight paths. They continuously changed altitude between 120 and 240 feet, following tree lines, rooftops, and structures around the edge of the airfield. Every time a UAV passed behind an obstacle, its radar return flickered within the ground clutter. The radar could detect them, but it could not yet maintain a target lock long enough to fire accurately. The Panzer crew decided to wait until the UAV formation entered an open corridor in front of the airfield before beginning the interception. And that became the battery commander's worst decision. The distance fell to 3 miles. The combat crew held the targets inside the aiming grid, waiting a few more seconds for the clearest firing window. But the Ukrainians were also waiting for that exact moment and decided to act first. When the range fell to about 2 miles, one FP-1 suddenly pulled its nose upward and climbed rapidly from near ground level to 1,500 feet. It became clearly visible against the sky and flew directly toward the Panzer position as a priority target. The turret immediately elevated. The 230mm cannons turned toward the UAV and opened fire. Thousands of rounds formed streaks of fire across the sky. The decoy FP-1 shook violently, broke apart, and began falling into the open field. But during the few seconds when all of the firepower had been drawn upward, another FP-1 had accelerated at full power while remaining at an extremely low altitude. It circled around the edge of the support buildings, approached from the flank, and flew into an angle that the Panzer turret could not rotate back toward quickly enough. At 150 miles per hour, the UAV needed only about 1 minute to cross the final 2 miles. The combat crew detected the second threat too late. There was no longer enough time to switch targets, rotate the turret, or launch a missile. The FP-1 crashed into the body of the Panzer S-1. An orange fireball erupted 90 feet into the air, followed by black smoke and metal fragments scattering around the position. The air defense system that had opened fire only seconds earlier had now been knocked out of action. 2 attack unmanned aerial vehicles worth roughly $100,000 were exchanged for an air defense system worth $15 million, and 2 FP-1s were still racing toward the base. They passed over the defensive positions, stayed close to the support buildings, and headed toward their pre-programmed targets. With Engels Air Base directly ahead, they climbed to an altitude of 600 feet and accelerated in preparation for their final dives. At 0440 hours local time, inside Engels Air Base, the Russian soldiers had no option left, except to use AK-74 rifles and Saiga-12 shotguns for interception. They fired continuously into the sky, trying to place their rounds ahead of the 2 targets approaching at 150 miles per hour. But luck did not come. The camera of the first FP-1 scanned the western section of the base. The Ukrainians knew exactly where to look. Commercial satellite imagery had identified the storage tanks, pipelines, and refueling area. The guidance system recognized the cluster of storage tanks, distance 1.4 miles, altitude 600 feet, time to target less than 35 seconds. The UAV banked slightly to the left, climbed another 200 feet, and then pushed its nose down at an angle of nearly 55 degrees. The dive began. Gravity increased its speed to more than 165 miles per hour. At a distance of 1,000 feet, only about 4 seconds remained before impact. Bursts of gunfire from the ground passed behind it, but the FP-1 kept its aiming point directly on the connection between the storage tank and the pipeline. The 220-pound fragmentation warhead detonated the instant the UAV struck the target. Overpressure near the center of the explosion could exceed 10 pounds per square inch, enough to tear apart metal panels, damage pumps, and rupture pipelines. Thousands of fragments penetrated the walls of the storage tanks. But the first explosion was only the beginning. Fuel spilled across the concrete surface and ignited. The temperature at the center of the fire quickly exceeded 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. 8 seconds later, a pressurized pipeline ruptured, spraying fuel into a burning mist. A fireball rose more than 100 feet into the air and spread into the adjacent logistics area. The second FP-1 was still in the air. Its camera locked onto the hangar complex where the Tu-95MS and Tu-160 bombers were being protected. It only needed to collapse the hangar doors, cut the power, and block the taxiway to keep them on the ground. Distance 1.1 miles. Altitude 620 feet. Time remaining 27 seconds. The UAV changed course 18 degrees to the south. One round penetrated the outer section of the left wing, causing the aircraft to bank slightly, but the autopilot immediately compensated. At a distance of 2,000 feet, the FP-1 pulled its nose upward and then entered a dive at an angle of nearly 60 degrees. The structure rapidly filled the frame, the hangar roof, the sliding doors, the forward connecting section. Impact speed nearly 175 miles per hour. The warhead penetrated the roof and detonated inside the semi-enclosed space. The shock wave reflected between the walls, roof, and floor. The support beams bent downward. The sliding doors were thrown off their tracks, and fragments swept through maintenance equipment and the wing section of a nearby Tu-95MS. The Tu-160 position deeper inside might not have been destroyed, but its exit was blocked by the deformed doorframe and tons of debris. The fuel depot was burning. The logistics area had lost power. The taxiway was blocked. Preparations for takeoff were forced to stop. The two FP-1s did not merely strike two structures. They struck the entire operational chain of Engels Air Base. Because sometimes the most effective way to keep a bomber on the ground is not to destroy the aircraft itself, but to destroy everything required to put it into the sky. In your opinion, should the final defensive layer at Engels prioritize protecting the aircraft, the fuel depot, or the runway? Leave your assessment, subscribe to Military Observers, and comment, "Peace for Ukraine."